talking about Ohio's electric grid and the future of renewable energy. Here in Ohio, your electric bill has two charges, one for delivery, the other for supply. Most of us have the illuminating company. As I understand it, they own and maintain the wires and the hardware to get the electricity to your house. But you can choose the company that supplies your electricity. For most of us, this is very confusing. We want to flip a switch and have it all work. But electricity in this state has been deregulated and you have choices. And our panel is here today to explain how this system works. We hope to challenge you with new information or perspectives on what the electrical grid is and how it works. Information that you will think about and perhaps even act on after you leave today. We have a mission at this church to search and to serve. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe in the continuing search for truth and the importance of serving others. We organize these forums as a congregational service to the community to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all who attend. We chose today's topic for discussion because we know that in 2018, carbon dioxide emissions from the generation of electrical power rose 1.8%, primarily from burning more natural gas. Is there something we can do about this? Our speakers are independent, interested citizens who have studied the grid and the options for electricity. They are not company spokesmen. They have opinions, but they're not advertising or promoting any particular product information. For more information, you need to check the website of each supplier and talk to the company representative. We have today Rich Schiferl. He's electrical engineering consultant and adjunct assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin. Liz Schiferl is a technical fellow for Lubrizol. And Norman Robbins is professor emeritus, founder and director of Case Western Reserve University Center for Environment. Here's my speakers.
So thank you everybody for coming out, and we hope to make this interesting. You'll have to, I guess, save questions unless they're really burning if it gets too complicated. And part of our mission here is to not make it complicated. So let's get into here. I'm just getting used to this. Let's start talking about what's going on that's changing right now. And there are and we'll be talking largely about renewable energy and what's happening to that, how it fits into the grid, how the grid may have to change or may not, and so on, because I think most, if not all of you, understand that climate change is becoming more and more urgent.
Is the microphone on?
Yeah.
I'm sorry? It's
Yeah, but it doesn't sound right.
more close?
Yes.
How's that?
Oh, much better.
Thank you. Okay. So climate change is becoming more urgent. We realize we've got to get busy, and I'll show you one graph on that in a moment. And then secondly, a very interesting thing that's happening that most people don't know about is that renewable energy, especially solar and wind, have decreased in price enormously over the last 10 years, so that in fact they're completely competitive in many places in this country with the next best natural gas, the next higher cost. So we have an economic drive as well as the climate drive. The problem is that hasn't really penetrated through in states like Ohio. And so we'll be talking about that. And then we'll talk about, we'll talk about how the grid works, the future of all of this, how renewable energy is bought and sold, and what you can do. And I'm going to pass around something at the end to talk about what you can do. Now, the most recent report from the International Panel on Climate Change said that if we want to keep the Earth's temperature from rising above this 1.5 degree from over the pre-industrial, we must drop our use of carbon dioxide emitting fuels by 45% in 10 or 11 years. And that's not much time. And I'll tell you where we are right now in a moment. So I'm going to come back to that 45%. So just to give you a little idea of the science, I'm sorry, I'll stay closer to here. Just to give you a little idea of the science, this is from the most recent October climate change report on this 1.5 degrees. So this is the temperature of the Earth, the mean surface temperature, and here are the years. And here's up until here's to where we were when this graph was made. And this is a projection as to where we're going in all likelihood with a certain range of uncertainty. Well, it turns out that the range of uncertainty is much larger than that, and that's encompassed by these colors. So, for instance, if we don't do anything about it, keep on business as usual, and also don't do anything about other greenhouse gases, we have this chance of between here and here of exceeding this 1.5 degrees. What's magic about the 1.5 degree? Nothing really, except that as we pass that, the consequences get to be extremely disastrous. We already have the disastrous consequences currently, you know about, but I'm saying that this is saying you better watch out for it getting worse. If we really got busy and reducing our carbon dioxide emissions, then the range of probabilities are this blue plume here, and so there's a chance that we'll lie underneath this 1.5 degree rise, and that we'll just miss it. But that's only, remember, I said this 45% drop in 11 years. That's not much time. Okay, enough of that stuff. Also, although I'm sure all of you know that China is now releasing more greenhouse gases than we are, if you look at what's up there in the atmosphere, the U.S. is the biggest donor to what's sitting up there right now. So we have a responsibility that goes way beyond our emissions versus China's and India's and everybody else, because we're the country that has put the most of these greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere. Okay. Now we get to today's topic, which is going to focus on electricity. Because of all the sources of greenhouse emissions, electricity is about 30%. And it's one that we as citizens can actually affect. And that's one of the reasons I'm here today, is to talk about what you can do in your own city, in your own home, to make a difference. Now, where are we now in terms of the fuels that we burn? Well, back several years ago, this is from 2001 to 2017, coal was the major source of our electric power. As you see here, the purple is nuclear, and the light brown is natural gas, and this is these are some of the other sources, and you see that coal dropped from I think that's 61% to about 30% of our electricity. That's the good news, right? Because coal is the most polluting greenhouse in terms of greenhouse gases. Natural gas, though, is the one that's taken up most of the gap that was left by coal. Natural gas is about half the greenhouse gas emitter as is coal. So it's better, but it's still not good enough. So if you think about where we are, so this is going forward. This is going from 2010 all the way to 2050, and this is a projection from the U.S. government Environmental Investigative Agency, which is charged with generating all our data on electricity and emissions and so on. And in that case, the blue is coal and it's gone down, but the brown is natural gas. And the combination of natural gas and coal is still, through 2050, the predicted bulk of our electricity sources. Which means if you make the calculation, remember I mentioned this 45% that we need to drop according to the IPCC. We need to drop that in 11 years. Well, so here's 2030 with this little triangle here, and the drop, yes, there is a change. There's more natural gas than there was in 2010, but there's less coal. That's good. But if you make the calculation, the drop in greenhouse gas emissions because of natural gas contribution, the total drop of these two is only 20%. So we're nowhere near where we need to be according to the IPCC and according to this projection. And so that's the problem we're going to be talking about more. We're talking about the grid, how it fits in with everything, and I'll pass over now to Rich.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the electric grid because it becomes important as we talk about adding new energy sources to our supply, you know, where that's coming from and how does it fit into the grid. So this is just a picture, you know, of the high voltage transmission lines that are in the United States, just to show that they're everywhere and they're all interconnected. If you look at the electric grid, there's a couple of physical laws that need to be always satisfied, and that means one of them is that end use has to equal generation. So at any instant of time, when you turn your air conditioner on at home, somewhere on the grid there has to be more power generated to provide that energy, because there's no storage. There's very little storage on the grid. So that's one of the rules. The other rule is that your electron looks like my electron, so you don't know where the electricity is coming from. We can have our electricity we're using in Ohio come from wind turbines that are in Texas, because everything is connected together, but you can't tell where it comes from. So when you talk about renewable energy and you're going to buy renewable energy for your home, you can do that, and there's some mechanisms in place that assure you that that's happening, but you can't tell by looking at the electron where it came from. The last thing is it's very highly interconnected, as I mentioned. So this represents the high voltage transmission lines. All regions of the United States are connected together, so power can be moved back and forth very easily. So what did the grid look like in the past? In the past, let's talk about 20 or 30 years ago. The grid generally is made up of generation, transmission, distribution, and end use. And 20 or 30 years ago, the generation, transmission, and distribution were all one company that owned all of that. Generation is just basically was classically and still mostly today rotating electric machinery, generators that are powered by turbines, either that are with coal, natural gas, nuclear, or hydro. And so it's all rotating equipment. That's what the grid was in the past. Energy sources are under complete control by the utilities. So we start talking about what's happening with the utilities and the grid. You have to think about who's controlling the sources. Well, in the past, this whole, most of what you see on this little diagram here was owned by the utilities. So they had complete control over when supply was made. They had to match what the demand was, but they had complete control over the supply. Everything basically went from the high level here generation to the high voltage transmission lines to the lower voltage distribution lines. That was all under their control. And basically no wind or solar. And the general belief 10 to 20 years ago was that, well, certainly 20 years ago, that 10, maybe 20% of renewables would be allowable on the grid with still maintaining stability so that the grid still works properly. So that was a general feeling. Now we move ahead to the present. Well, the present, we have these renewable sources that are coming online. Most of them, you know, today still are, in most places, still are close to the transmission level, but there is some that's local, and some of it's on rooftops of homes. In fact, there's some in parking lots of churches, in fact. So generation now is operated from a separate company, so that's also happened. That was mentioned in the introduction. You know, there's a transmission and distribution companies, and there's generation companies, and some of these generation companies may not even be utilities. It may just be somebody that puts up solar panels or wind turbines, and they create generating capacity that goes onto the grid. There's some renewable sources depending on where you live. If you live in Ohio, it's 3%. If you live in Hawaii, it may be up to 50% that's renewable energy sources. It's some connected into distribution, as I mentioned, more further down the line. And these new energy sources are more fickle in the sense that the power company, whatever you call that, you know, the ones that manages, and I'll talk about that, you know, they really can't control what's happening on your solar power grid. I mean, your solar panels that are on your house. They don't have direct control over that. So when that gets put onto the grid, they just have to deal with it. Okay, so it's not completely controlled by utilities. And also, renewables are not always available because when the sun goes down, you don't have solar energy. Now, the good news is there's an awful lot of research that's gone on in the last 20 years. And still continuing. University Department of Energy looking at energy storage methods, grid management with this new distributed power, and try and understand, you know, how do we operate systems with more than 50% of renewables online. So we talk about what is electricity and your electric bill, and this was mentioned before. So I took my February electric bill from our home, it was $164, a little over 1,000 kilowatt hours that I used. And look at the split between what I'm paying for. The blue here is the cost of energy for me, which was $68. I pay a little bit premium, $16, to make sure that all my energy comes from wind or renewable. So all of our electric energy at our house is renewable energy. About half of what I pay on a monthly basis goes to the distribution and transmission line company. Okay, so when we talk about the cost of renewables, really only half of what you're paying for your electric bill is what you're paying for where the power comes from. Okay, the rest is based on transmission distribution. Now, adding more renewables may affect the cost of transmission, the cost to get the energy to your house. In fact, it may drive it down because you don't need these big transmission lines because the energy will be generated close to where you use it. So that's a possibility, but certainly it's going to change. Now, who controls the grid? Well, the grids are controlled by regional transmission organizations, and ours is PJM, which means Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland. That's what PJM stands for. And it's this region here. It's a very large region, goes from the East Coast to all of Ohio, parts of Indiana, and the Chicago area. Regional transmission organizations are nonprofit, public benefit corporations created in the 1990s when the utilities were split up from the generating and transmission suppliers, regulated by the federal government. You know, ours is one of the first ones that was created was PJM. And you'll see PJM mentioned in newspaper articles when people talk about, hey, we're going to shut down the nuclear power plants. How does that going to affect the stability of the grid? So they're the ones that make those decisions because they control the power that goes over the transmission lines in this area, who supplies it and where it's allocated. And so they have a very good feeling of what it means by grid stability when the supplies change from large nuclear power plants to localized solar and wind turbine plants. They have already decided that it's not necessary to prop up those nuclear power plants with government subsidies. They said we don't need those, we can be okay without them. Our energy and First Energy, which is a local Ohio utility, this is the current mix of generation. It's about a third coal, about a third natural gas, and about a third nuclear. With a little bit of wind and solar. About 3% of Ohio's energy generation is renewable wind and solar. And the mix is, as Norman was saying, is moving from coal to natural gas more than anything else. Energy storage. So now we have renewable energy sources that are not always there. So what are we going to do when we need them, we don't have it? So you have to have energy storage. So a lot of research is going on in batteries. In fact, in 2018, the amount of installed capacity of battery energy storage on the utility doubled in the United States. Well, it doubled from a very small number, but it doubled. So it's going up very rapidly. A lot of research on lithium-ion type battery energy storage systems. Compressed air and flywheels are really small systems, and they're not very widely out there. The largest energy storage system in the United States and worldwide is pumped hydro. You can see here on this bar chart, this is pumped hydro, and all the other ones here are, probably 50 to 100 times smaller in capacity than what we have in pumped hydro. So what does pumped hydro look like? It looks like this. Looks pretty nice, right? It's pumped hydro just means that the excess electrical energy that's generated during times when the demand is low, for instance in the evenings, is used to supply power to pumps that pump water from a lower level to a higher level. So this big lake up here is a battery. It's storing energy. And then during the day, when you need power during peak times, when there may not be enough power on the grid, you just run electric turbines here through the dam to supply power back to the grid. So that's energy storage. That's the cheapest way to do it today and the most common way. And the reason these exist is because back in the 70s and 80s, nuclear power plants were built. And nuclear power plants are the type of plants where it's really difficult just to turn them off at night. And so it works better to have them continually run. And so there's energy generated. And so they found ways to take that energy and pump it into lakes so that during the day, when the energy requirements are very high, they could draw from the lake to satisfy the peak power requirements and not have to use the nuclear power plant or add more capacity in other ways. So what are the impacts of renewables on the grid? Well, we have this whole area of decentralized control. As I mentioned before, the utilities don't have complete control of all the supplies now. These new energy sources, wind and solar, are based on power electronics, which means that they can be controlled very rapidly, as opposed to well, that's much better. As opposed to the spinning resources. If you have a large turbine that's rotating, it's very difficult to change its state very rapidly. So this is very helpful. That's very helpful to have fast response. There's a reduced need for spinning reserve. You can actually control a power electronic device to look like a rotating generator. So that's possible. There will be increased need for cost-efficient energy storage, which is why all this battery storage is coming up. And then you can kind of see what the future may be if you look at what Hawaii is doing. There are some regions in Hawaii where 50% of their energy is supplied by renewable sources, wind and solar. 25% of that is behind the meter, which means it could be rooftop solar that the utility has no control over. There's a lot of studies going on now to understand how that system works. In some regions of Hawaii, 1/3 of the homes have solar panels on their roofs. And they've found that they can make this manageable. So by direct experience as well as university research, people are finding ways to make renewables be more than half the energy supply. Okay, so what's it going to look like in the future? Well, we get to this microgrids where we have regions where power is generated that may be close to where the users are. Over here, this could be an Amazon data center, a Google data center where they have wind and solar and maybe some gas turbines that allow them to keep their power on even if everything else falls away. These could be distributed throughout the energy system, throughout the grid. Renewables may be bigger than 50% of generation. Most of them are connected on the distribution side. Energy storage is everywhere. And this means that system planning has to be based on distributed energy resources. There may be less need for transmission lines, as I mentioned before, and power generation and end use is in the same neighborhood. And these microgrids are interesting because you could have local pockets of energy generation utilization that can be disconnected from the grid. That's why there's big switches here. When something happens on the grid, or they may decide, hey, we're going to go solo for a while, and so that makes the management, these RTOs, the regional transmission organizations that are controlling the grid, how to manage all that has become more and more of a challenge, and certainly they're working on understanding how best to do that. And now I turn it over to Liz.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the costs and trends and government incentives and things like that, and a little bit about demand. So first I'm going to start with looking at something that Rich mentioned, which is the wind and solar growth has been really rapid in the past few years. So since 2016, we can see that wind has gone up 8.5 times, solar 71 times, but again, you're starting from a small number. But one interesting thing is that in 2016, we reached kind of a tipping point. And by that I mean that the newly installed generation facilities capacity worldwide, the amount of energy in these new facilities that's renewable has exceeded the amount that's going to be from a non-renewable, a fossil fuel source. So we've tipped so that anything new it's gonna be more likely to come from a renewable source than from a fossil fuel source. So how has that so what has happened to cost? Well, solar is the pink line on there, that's what this plot really demonstrates. This is the so-called levelized cost of energy. So this is how much you'd have to charge per kilowatt hour for projects to break even over their lifetime. So solar has gone down a lot, wind's gone down a lot, and the others kind of have stabilized, but in the end what we see is that nationally solar and wind are cheaper than the other sources. And we can see that in Ohio too. Rich put up our electric bill. Actually we're gonna talk a little bit more about this later, but if you look at the different ways you can buy your electricity, 100% renewable, there's a couple plans there. The bar chart shows you basically what that cost would be for an annualized for a household. And 50% renewable, 0% renewable, the costs are about the same. So the question is that you gotta tell them that you want the 100% renewable because that's not necessarily gonna be the default. So now I'm going to focus on wind power because wind power has a lot of implications for Ohio, and this is a map of the United States, and every state is a different color depending on how much wind power is generated. You can see there's really a lot in Texas, a lot in California, very little in the south, and then there's Ohio, and on the right there's a picture of just the different places in Ohio where we have some kind of facilities. And so, as we said before, there's very little from right now in Ohio wind power. So what is the potential for wind in Ohio? Well, right now we generate between installed and under construction and development, there's probably about 887 megawatts, but the potential between land and offshore is much, much greater, 187,000 megawatts, which means right now we are using less than 1% of our potential wind power. So there's a lot of opportunity for more wind power. There are a lot of benefits when there's wind farms are put in. One thing that happens is there's investment in the workforce to construct the facilities, 40 to 160 jobs per 100 megawatts of generating capacity, and then there's some permanent jobs that are left over maintaining that facility. Usually the economy, the local economy is can be rewarded because there's property and income taxes, and there's a kind of a tax for power facilities where it's called pilot, payment in lieu of taxes, and they're based on the energy production. So then rather than paying for your acreage, you pay for how much energy that you produced. And then the farmers who actually will lease the land where the wind turbines are can get a payment between $4,000 and $8,000. If you know anything about farming, that can make the difference between making it and not making it. In Ohio, they think that those lease payments are somewhere between $1 and $5 million. And just for example, for one county, Van Wert County and Blue Creek Wind Farm, they were able to put in their wind farm before some of the recent changes in legislation. And right now, Blue Creek is the largest taxpayer in that county. It pays $2.7 million a year, or 25% of the county budget. So if you think about a small rural community with no way of getting, new businesses or whatever, all of a sudden you put in a wind farm and your budget goes up 25%. Think what that can do for your schools or your other public facilities. And in addition, there's another $2 million or more in lease payments to the farmers in those areas, the landowners. Other benefits, there's a lot of direct and indirect jobs, just making the peripheral equipment that supports a wind farm, the nuts and bolts of it. Right now in Ohio, there's about 2,000 to 3,000 jobs like that in 2017. And a fun fact, even though Ohio is dismally low in wind power generation, we're the #1 state for wind-related manufacturing. So all of the parts that go into that, they mostly come from Ohio. And then something else is water resources, which are something else we're going to have to pay attention to in the future, in that wind uses really no water whatsoever. Coal, gas, ethanol, they can use a lot of water in their production. And just here in Ohio for 2017, we probably saved about 2 billion gallons of water by using wind power for our mining, tiny little 3% or 2.5%. So now I'll talk a little bit, we know it's good, all the benefits locally that it can have. Now I'll talk a little bit about some things that the government has done to try to move people towards renewable things. And in Ohio, we have some legislation that was passed in 2018, which just mandated that utilities get a certain percent of their energy from a renewable source. 12.5% by 2025, that was the goal. That's been pushed back a little bit by, in 2014, and you'll hear various arguments down in Columbus about this, and overriding it by CASIC and things like that, but that's one way of trying to get people to use renewables more. There's something called the Clean Power Plan, which was an EPA plan that was started during the Obama administration. That's the one, and its goal was to just reduce carbon emissions. And so every state had to have a plan on how they were going to reduce their carbon emissions. The goal was 32% by 2030. Each state had to submit a plan by 2018, or the EPA was going to make one for them. So those plans are already out there. This is the thing that Trump administration announced repeal of. So that was, now they said the EPA is going to repeal that law. We don't want to have that anymore. It'll take about 2 years for that to work through the EPA system, and there's going to be a lot of lawsuits. But that was another incentive. And you'll see how that's played out in a few slides. And then there's something called this Federal Production Tax Credit, PTC, which has actually been around since 1992. And that was like it was based on per kilowatt hour of produced electricity generated by renewable sources. And, that was like a rebate back to the power companies that were willing to devote dollars to building very renewable power plants, such as putting in turbines or wind farms. Now, they started phasing that down in 2016. It stops completely in 2020. But if you look at some of the research that's been done on this, they say that this PTC was really responsible for the growth in wind power more than any of those renewable mandates, because it allowed them, gave them a little bit of boost in their, the cost structure for developing wind farms. So if you put those things together, you have this investment help, you have the threat of losing other power sources. You're not going to be able to. You're limiting the amount of CO2, so you can't use your coal anymore. We got some promising behavior by power companies in that last year in December, there was an auction for the development rights to 3 offshore wind farms off the East Coast. And in that auction, the top bid, now we're gone again. The top bid for those wind leases was greater than the value of all 7 previous leases combined. So people were, the power companies are going to pay a lot for this. That amount was 3 times greater than what they were willing to pay for offshore drilling rights. So wind is becoming something that obviously power companies are thinking is going to be something they have to do, and they're willing to pay for that. If those 3 areas were developed, it would be able to provide enough power for 1.5 million homes. So there's some promising behavior. And now I'm going to turn it over to Norm to talk a little bit more about corporate demand.
Thank you. So I have good news and bad news, about what's going on with renewables, both nationally and in Ohio. The good news is that a lot of major corporations, especially the tech corporations like Google and Microsoft, have now a company policy that they will only get 100% renewable electricity, period. And there are quite a few companies that are already there. Walmart is going to be there in a few years. It's on the way there, and so on. So the drive from the corporate sector is one of the most positive things that's happening nowadays. And this just shows you how much the increase is of that kind of corporate demand, and that's continued beyond the data of this slide. And it's, to give you an example, it's mostly been on wind, because I think wind is a little bit easier to develop in terms of the land use that it requires per kilowatt and the efficiencies. So most of these corporations that have invested in renewables have used mostly, except for Apple, have used mostly wind. But that is actually happening a great deal now. Some people think that one of the reasons why Columbus did not attract Amazon as it might have is because there's no the wind facilities are really minimal or very low in Ohio compared to what you heard about. They're less than 1% of the capacity. And here's the growth in renewable. The 10 top states, the 10 top states growth is here versus Ohio, and you can see how far behind we are. I'll get into the reason for that in a little bit. And here's comparing Ohio development of various forms of electricity in these dark brown versus national, and renewables development is 2% or so versus 13% nationwide. By the way, the nationwide figure includes states like Iowa and Kansas that are over 35% of their electricity now. These are red states, by the way, or at 35 or more percent of their electricity comes from wind. So it's getting to be non-political, and indeed, well, I'll tell you about a little more about that if we have time later. Ohio, again, this is bad news, is how far behind the number of utility scale wind projects in Ohio is small compared to surrounding states that have similar kinds of wind availability. And the investment is in Ohio is also less, and it's out there. And now, why is this so? I mean, we've said wind and solar are cheaper. Corporations are lining up to get it. We desperately need it for climate change. Why isn't it sort of going gangbusters? The reason that this is true in Ohio is largely political. And we have a very powerful fossil fuel lobby. And so, for instance, in the middle of the night in 2014, they put in a bill that said, if you want to build a wind farm, we're going to double the distance you have to be from the nearest property. And it means that on a given piece of land, you have to shrink where you can put your windmills, and so you can put less than half the number of windmills on the same piece of land as you could before. And so our restrictions in terms of the feet from the nearest property in Ohio, as a result of that bill, this is where other places and other states are on those restrictions. We're more than two times worse. That bill is still in effect. And there's a move afoot, and I'm going to pass around a clipboard later on for people that like to join on something. There's a move afoot to try to reverse that back, and there's a chance that it will be, because there's some now Republican backers of reversing our setback rules so that they're not so restrictive. But the fact is, here's just one major wind developer that wanted to build 6 wind farms in Ohio and has recently canceled 3 of them. The reason being, in part, these setbacks that have not been changed since they were made so restrictive, and also because fossil fuel proponents and local people who have both genuine concerns about windmill, but also a ton of misinformation about the health effects of windmill, turn out at all the meetings and they scare the politicians, and the end result is that despite all these benefits, the community benefits that Liz talked about, they're turning them down. And that, here you see it, and the results of that are, in the case of just this one developer, Ohio lost, as a result of those cancellations, the investment they would have made from about 4 billion has gone down to 1 billion, so we've lost 3 billion. It's certainly the amount of power and the number of jobs have all gone down as a result of this. So this is the problem that we have. Okay, very briefly in terms of what you can do, I think there's first a little bit of information, and then I'll talk a little bit, just a tiny bit about what you can do. A few minutes, yeah, and the kind of ways that people buy power is either in large chunks. This is called a power purchase agreement, and so a corporation might build a wind farm or a solar farm with this kind of agreements. The kind that we're mostly concerned with as homeowners and consumers are called renewable energy certificates. This is where when you buy some electricity, you get with it a certificate that says that you get 1 point, one certificate for every megawatt hour of electricity, and you get with that a guarantee that somewhere, someplace, it came from a renewable source, a windmill or solar, so that if you buy 100% renewable, you're getting that via these certificates. The actual power that you get when you plug into your home is the power you saw that Rich talked about, which is 1/3 coal, nuclear, and natural gas. But what you have done is, by buying 100% renewable, is you have said somewhere in the grid it's getting your certificate's worth of electricity, and that displaces the need for fossil fuel. And, as important, it shows the demand. And the demand in Ohio is increasing. And as I said, because the price of electricity is going down. Okay, so very quickly, what can you do? First, you can buy 100% electricity for your home at very competitive rates, either through NOPEC, the Northeast Ohio Public Energy Council, and I'm going to pass around a little sheet that explains how you do that. It's a phone call, or if you want to do due diligence and check out other competing sources, it gives you the information how to do that. And I'll pass this a little sheet around. Just take one for yourself. There's a whole bunch of them if you think you might. The other thing you can do so the first thing is to switch to 100% electricity if you're not there already. And by the way, by switching from, if you're with NOPEC, 50%, which you're probably on, to 100%, that turns out to cut your greenhouse gas emissions. Whoops, yeah.
So what, we have like 50%?
Your greenhouse gas emissions by about 5%. I'll not worry about this. Secondly, I'm just floating a pass around that you can sign up if you would like to become active in your community on campaigning for NOPEC to make this known to all its customers, 100%, and for them and for you to help lobby your city council so that this becomes the default option, which would, NOPEC, if it advertised the availability of 100% very clearly on a letter it sends that letter to 490,000 households in northern Ohio. So imagine an impact it might have, even with a lot of people suspicious about 100%, there'd still be a lot there. So there's a lot we can do. I'm going to pass around these two clipboards. One is for you to take the information about how to change your electricity, and the other is if you want to sign up to help out, either on this or with a wind power group that is already existing and doing a lot of advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you for all this great information. It's question and answer time at this point. With the questions, we're gonna have 2 people with microphones. They will control the questions, not the speakers. And I have clipboards. Each section will get a clipboard. If you're not on our list and want to get on our mailing list, we need your email address. We don't share your email address with anyone. And thank you. Here. Okay. She's getting the clipboards out, and then the question microphone. Just raise your hand if you have a question. Microphone, people will find you.
I have a question for, oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm just getting it back.
Go ahead, Carol. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have a question for Norman.
Yes.
I was wondering about, I've never heard that before, that we manufacture most of the parts for wind. Did I hear that correctly? Ohio?
We have more, I'm sorry. To be exact, Ohio has more numbers of manufacturers of parts per state than any other state, but we're not the majority of all manufacturing. It's just that our state is the highest in terms of numbers of companies that manufacture parts for.
Well, where are these people when it comes to lobbying our legislature? If you're laughing about my question.
I never thought of that.
Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, there are a few that have been very ardent lobbyists, but what happens is it works through often through a chamber of commerce or an economic development corps, and so the issue of whether they should promote renewables comes to this corps, and they get all the positive information about the economic value, which is almost undoubted, and then they get a whole crowd of people start showing up with yellow shirts, anti-wind, and scare the living Jesus out of the people, and so they end up not supporting the wind facility. And that keeps on happening, and that's exactly why this Power of Wind group is trying to work with other groups, including Republican groups, to reverse that.
Is this on?
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay.
No, it's not.
I don't think it's on.
Justin.
Yep. Thank you. Could you say what is happening in Cuyahoga County? I read in the newspaper that the county office of sustainability is moving toward a green bank that could help finance renewables. So if you could say something about that, and also where our various chambers of commerce are. They have a lot of the influence. So the other thing is that I'm going to be in the back of the room after the meeting, and I have petitions on the lead poisoning of children in Cleveland. If you live in the city of Cleveland and are a registered voter, please see me, or if you want to circulate a petition. Thank you.
Those legal petitions?
Yeah.
Couple of questions.
Not the green, but yeah. Okay,
Couple of questions.
Sorry, I'm answering your first question in about the green bank. I don't have any new specifics. I've heard that they're working on it. This office, but one very interesting thing that's happening right now, and that again, your community might be interested in joining, is that Cuyahoga Sustainability Office is making an agreement with the solar panel installers to have government and related buildings, could be school buildings, have solar panels at no extra cost for the government or the schools. They're put up by the installers, and they pay their electric bills to the installers, and that's how the installers recoup their money. But as far as the government or school is concerned, they're paying the same electric bill they paid before, except now they have solar panels up there. That agreement is being negotiated right now by the county. So if any of you are related to governments or schools that might be interested in this, that option is opening up, and it looks like it's going to go through. I'm sorry.
Question first. I don't hear much about the aircraft pollution, and I just wondered if that had anything to do with our problems. Solar energy panels, I guess, are some of the best in the world right now, and even the Chinese are really hurting to catch up with that. So I just wondered your comments on those things.
Regarding aircraft, I do know that there's a lot of research on electric aircraft, and that's coming, will be coming in the next 20 years. And the concept is to have aircraft that are powered by electric motors rather than gas turbines, with renewable energy supplying the battery energy source, and much more energy efficient, can take off and land with virtually no noise, and can take off from very small airports, so that you could have regional airports that have connections between cities that are like between Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus, where you could do this very simply. It's more like a replacement for high-speed rail. That research is going on. It's not here yet, but it's coming. It's supposed to be much more economical than what the aircraft are today. So that is happening. It's not going to happen in the next 5 years, but maybe in the next 10 years we'll see that. I don't know about the greenhouse gases with aircraft versus everything else. I don't know what that ratio is.
Well, I have a little information. If the amount, amount of greenhouse gas released by aircraft is among the highest in terms of transportation, getting from here to there, especially in the takeoff and landing, requires a lot of energy and greenhouse gas use. One thing that's interesting, though, is it's very temporary, is that you can go to websites and offset the greenhouse gas emission by making a donation to a greenhouse gas reducing project, say preserving a rainforest someplace. And there are several websites that allow you to calculate how much you need to pay to offset. It's kind of a guilt fee, but nonetheless, it's you know, for the time being, until the kind of thing that Rich is talking about comes about. One idea that, again, if we had some citizen communities that I think might be interesting, would be to have our citizens be aware of that, because we do a lot of air travel, especially grandparents. And so if you, say, travel to San Francisco and so on, you figure out how much tons of CO2 that's using, and give that money to a fund that would be used in your local community, in Cleveland Heights or in Euclid or someplace, and that money would be used to promote greenhouse gas reduction in your own community. So I think that's an idea. It needs some citizens to get up and work on it.
Actually, I just bought airline tickets, and I was allowed to, they say I want a surcharge to offset my greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
So if you pay attention when you're buying your airline ticket, you can find that. It was $1.50 all the way to Minnesota.
That's cheap.
Previously, I had heard that some of the wind panels that were going to be constructed into the lake and everything were injurious to the bird life, etc. Could you tell us whether there's been anything done so that, I don't know how, you can't talk to the birds, but what else do you do in order to make them safer?
Well, actually, you can talk to the birds, because there are ways to avoid collisions with wind turbines by putting things on the wind turbines that tell the birds not to run into them. That's possible to do. And people always cite these statistics that, there are more bird deaths by cats than there are by wind turbines, and that's probably also true. So there is technology available. I know that for the project on Lake Erie, there was a lot of studies done to make sure that it's being placed where the bird paths are not that extensive. And I know that this research on being able to put things on the wind turbines in order to avoid collisions with birds is kind of new, and I don't think that they had thought about that when they were looking through those studies. So.
Okay, yes. You mentioned government and public buildings as an option in terms of basically a lease that gets paid off by giving money back to the grid. Is there anything for residential at this point? Because I think there was in the past, there were certain leases and things, and would that work in Cleveland when, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes, et cetera?
There's something called community solar that the county has one project that I think is either in the works, or I'm not exactly sure of the status, where a whole bunch of households aggregate and then support a solar farm, not on the premises, but get the credit for that amount of electricity that is now solar. And so that's one way because you see, a solar panel is at this point still on a single house is a fairly expensive way to go to get renewable electricity. It's great for people that want to do it, but as it's expensive, and whereas a utility scale that is a much larger scale, a solar or wind farm can make that work economically.
Hi. I just want to know, the people in the yellow shirts, what are they so afraid of, and why are they so against wind power, and why do they have so much power, period?
There's a lot of different level answers to that. I've been to a few of those sessions. This is Western Ohio, where we have most of our wind, and I've talked to some of the people, and a lot of them have a whole litany of fearful things about windmills that are going to happen, that they cause epilepsy because of the flicker, that the low sound rate is going to affect your hearing and your brain, and that they're going to crash through into the land underneath, and so on and so forth. Most of those things have been totally discredited, and yet they're still being promoted by groups that are against it. Now, in all fairness to them, there are many who say, I like this rural atmosphere that I'm living in, and I hate to see this giant turbine, and they're very large. They're now 600 feet high and huge, and that's what's making them more efficient and cheaper for electricity. But they say, I just don't want to look at something like that, and that is true. So it's a NIMBY kind of thing. But I think the first part, all the fears are, and you look at their websites and everything else, and you here and there you get information that suggests that the fossil fuel people are kind of supporting this, but the information is not a smoking gun.
Okay. I've been sort of sitting with this question for most of the thing, and it's blocked my absorption of half the information. But the first two slides were confusing to me, because in 2010 we needed to go down 45%, and we've reached 2018, and we're 17% down. Then it sounds like we're halfway there, and I know I must have misunderstood something.
okay, I'm sorry, it is a confusing thing, and trying to get it, you know, explained in a short time. So what the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, said is that from 2010, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030.
Right.
Because if we don't, we're really likely to exceed this.
I got that.
Okay, so what I'm saying, and you heard already from Debbie that in fact, the U.S. is not decreasing last year; they increased the greenhouse, so it's even worse than that. So where the projection is for 2030, if we keep going the way we are going, is that instead of reducing 43%, which is what we need to do, we're only going to be reducing by 20%. So we're only doing half as much as we need in order to avoid a very, very serious climate change emergency.
You're saying that if we continue at 17%, it's not
At the
gonna-
rate we're going, according to the projection, we'll only get halfway there. We will get nowhere near where we have to be. And mind you, those projections are, if you took the worst case, you would be really gloomy about all of this. I mean, those projections have a range of probabilities that we're talking about.
Hello, good morning. My name is Harold Isaacs. I was born in Cleveland, 1919.
You have a question?
I am here to make the first public announcement of the Cleveland developed solar energy heat pump electric power plant. It is a Cleveland product. Two of my technical associates are members of Nassau Glen. The basic, our plant is fully fueled by solar energy.
Do you have a question?
We discovered that we can use a body of water as a solar collector. There is absolutely zero environmental damage and at least 30% under current costs. The investment capital in the plant is also lower. The basic physics.
Do you have a question, though?
What?
Do you have a question?
No.
Give the mic to somebody who does.
The first public announcement.
Thank you.
So I have literature for this if you want it. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech.
I've got a question for either Richard or Liz, and the projections for the cost of solar power keep dropping faster than experts at a given time predict. I assume the same is for storage. If you had to put a date on the time when the average Cleveland home would be a net provider of energy to the grid, when would that be?
You wanna take that? Well, I've been involved in research for a long time. Everybody always says you just say 10 years from now. So that's always the answer. I think it'll probably be a little bit more than 10 years before we get to that point. But it is amazing how fast it's dropping. And really, solar panels are kind of like electronics, Moore's law. It follows that. Where the spinning mass generators, which we have, they're kind of old. I mean, I do a lot of research. That's where my expertise is. They're getting better, but they're kind of old. They're not going to improve at that rate. So.
Okay.
And I think a lot of it has to do with what Rich was saying about the distribution and the management of the power, not just if you got solar panels. And so, it's very important, I think, to keep funding that research through funding universities and funding, Department of Energy stuff. So, because that's where so much of what we know now has come from.
I have a question. This relates both to politics and to energy, because traditionally Ohio's a swing state, and the most critical areas to win are the Northwest Ohio and the Stark County, Canton, Ohio. Now, my understanding is the biggest coal donor is a magnet out of St. Clairsville, Ohio, and that fracking has basically resuscitated downtown Canton. On the other hand, you've got First Solar in Toledo, and I'm not sure how much support that's gotten from the state legislature. So how do you win battles when you produced, Ohio's relied on so many jobs being produced by the coal, natural gas industry in northeast Ohio and southeast Ohio, and I don't perceive that there's a lot of political clout for First Solar in Toledo. Who wins this battle politically, and who's been fighting it?
That is a really tough question, and all I can say is that the arguments for economic development solely, you know, this Power of Wind group that I mentioned and I passed around, it's mentioned, and you can sign up if you're interested in, about of the working members, about half of them are Republicans, and they are focused on economic development. They see the far greater long-term jobs potential of renewable energy, certainly compared to coal is definitely on the way out. It's just got gazillion things. So jobs from coal have been declining and will continue to do so. Natural gas is very important in Ohio economically right now, and so that will carry a lot of weight. Nonetheless, there's enough of these job growth and investment growth that Liz talked about to make the case on an economic grounds alone for increasing renewable energy in Ohio substantially. So, for instance, we expect that in the next month or two, a Republican Senator, Matt Dolan, will be introducing a bill to restore more reasonable setbacks. And there's movement in the Senate, Ohio Senate and House to back that. It may or may not pass. It's one of the things that takes citizen activity to.
Time for one more question.
Someone's got the microphone
already, I think.
Yeah, I object to that gentleman not being able to state what he wanted to explain to you. But my question
this is just
I
a question
have
answer.
a question. My question is, what companies, energy companies, are working the hardest to prevent renewables?
Well, we can, I just learned the other day that there's a whole list of lobbyists and what they earn in Ohio that's publicly available somewhere on the state website, and we know that many of them are lobbyists for coal and natural gas companies. For instance, the governor just recently appointed a man by the name of Sam Randazzo as head of the Public Utilities Commission, and you can look him up and you'll see that he has been working for fossil fuel companies for many, many years, lobbying for them. And so it's not, this is not a hard job to understand that they are fighting what in the long run has got to be a losing battle because of climate change and because of the economics of renewable are now aligned. And so it's a losing battle, but as long as they have a lot of money and can hire lobbyists and can donate to legislators more than the renewable energy people can, What it's gonna need, the only way is citizen involvement, to get out there and make the case, because you're concerned, as I am. That's why I'm here. I mean, I'm concerned about my children and grandchildren. What kind of world are we gonna grow up in? I mean, if you spend $50,000 or $60,000 to send them every year to college, and what do you spend on climate change? You know, because that's going to be one of the biggest things in interfering with their whole world. And another thing I'll say, the last thing, because obviously I'm kind of worked up about this, is that this is an equity issue. I think that Puerto Rico was the best example. Who suffered the most from all of these hurricanes and and winds and flooding was Puerto Rico, because they're poor. Who can move quickly? If you had to move to someplace else that wasn't ravaged by floods or wildfires, who has the resources to do that? It's going to be wealthy folks, and people who don't have those resources are going to be stuck. So climate change is looming as a major issue of equity in our society.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Thanks to our panel. Further information. Our panel's going to stick around for a few minutes to answer questions. You can come up to them. And our next forum is in 2 weeks, March 17th. It's the dominance of blockchain technology. Is Cleveland a center for this? And you're all invited to our morning church service upstairs at 11 o'clock. This sermon is titled The Shape of Our Habits with Dr. Alan Georgia. Thank you.
Where is the information that Norm said was going around?
I passed it around. I don't know what happened.
It's in the bag.
It's in the back.
I'll begin to run out.
Thank you.